Hey guys, Relic here. It's been a while, but today I'll be doing another tech-related video. Today I'm going to be talking about curving and how to troubleshoot curving problems. So, if you've been airsoft sniping for any amount of time, you've probably encountered the following problem. You fire a shot and instead of the BB going straight, it curves off to one side or the other. This is, well, obviously very annoying because if your shots aren't going straight, it's harder to aim. And it can also be a rather difficult problem to solve, but in this video I'm going to explain what the cause of curving is and, more importantly, how to fix it. So, in order to fix the curving problem, we first have to understand what's causing the curving problem. So, let's take a look at the Hopup bucking again. This is when viewed through the barrel, so if you were to look directly through the bore, this is what the Hopup bucking would look like. If you look from the top, it might look something like this. Let's say this is the Hopup contact patch. What you want is equal pressure everywhere, because that means that the BB is getting solid straight backspin. What usually happens in some very small amount is that there is more force, more pressure on the BB on one side than there is on the other side. And this means that the BB is going to be retained more on one side than on the other side. And what that does, it's going to induce some left spin or right hand spin. So normally, if the pressure is perfectly straight everywhere, then the BB has a backspin, it's spinning around its axis. So it's moving in the X direction, there's a spin around the Z axis, and due to the Magnus effect that's causing a force in the Y axis, which is what you want. But if there's a right spin or a left spin, and then the BB is also rotating on the Y axis, and that's going to cause a force in the Z axis, and that's going to make it fly left or right, which is what you don't want, of course. This is a linear system, so superposition fully applies. You can view both of these spins separately from each other. In reality, the BB is going to be doing something like this, over exaggerated, of course. The left-right spin is usually very small, but it is there, and well, that's what's causing the right and left spin. That's what's causing the BB to fly right or left. So what you want is a bucking that applies even pressure everywhere, so that you purely have backspin and no right or left spin. So how does this problem arise? Let's look at the normal scenario first. Usually when you have a bucking, it will look like this. And then you have a nub on top of it, looking like this. This is the perfect scenario. But what usually happens, one way or another, is that the bucking, its contact patch, is not perfectly straight. And neither is the contact patch of the nub. So this is the perfect scenario. But if you take this bucking and put this nub on top of it, you're going to have a left-hand curve. If you take this bucking and put this nub on top of it, you're going to have a left-hand curve as well. If you take this bucking with this nub, then you're going to have an extremely left-hand curve. But if you take this nub, flip it 180 degrees, so let's say the nub was sitting this way, and you turn it around, it now looks like this. Bear in mind, this is obviously over-exaggerated, but if you put this bucking with this nub in your gun, then the problem may very well go away. Because, well, here it's exaggerated a lot, but the difference in thickness is usually very small. We're talking micrometers here. So it's not going to have a real extreme impact on the shape of the bucking of the nub itself, just the thickness between the arm and the actual BB. So that is actually the first thing I would recommend trying. Is if you have a curving problem, take the nub, switch it 180 degrees and see if that does anything at all. There could be three possible outcomes of switching the nub. Option number one, nothing happens. If nothing happens, then your nub is perfectly fine and your bucking is flawed, so the curve is caused by the bucking. Option number two, the curve remains, but it switches to the other way. So if you had a right hand curve, you now have a left hand curve. If that's the case, then the problem was with your nub. Your bucking was fine and the nub was curving. So when you switched it, the thick end is now at the other end of the bucking and the curve is now the other direction. And option number 3 is the curve goes away, or at least becomes small enough to not be noticeable anymore. And that's why this is a good solution, because this bucking and this nub do not exist. There's always some curve one way or another. No bucking, no nub is perfect. The difference, the imperfections are usually very, very small, very minor, but there's always some curve. So your bucking is always curving a bit and your nub is always curving a bit. So if you have a left hand curve, then maybe they're both curving left, and if you switch the nub around, they cancel each other out. So that's why I would always try switching the nub first. If rotating the nub doesn't work, then you will either have to replace the nub or the bucking, or even both of them if that's necessary. So if the curve doesn't go away when you switch the nub, the bucking is the problem. If the curve switches to the other side when you rotate the bucking, then the nub, when you rotate the nub, then the nub is going to be the problem and you need to change the nub out. Now there are a few other cases. So let's talk about the chamber as well, because the chamber can also be rather important. Many times when people have curving problems and they use the original Tokyo Marui chamber, this is because the arm is not shimped properly, or because they use the original adjuster, which is not very good. If that's the case, if your nub is okay, if your bucking seems okay, but you still have curving problems and you're using a stock chamber, that may be the problem. So some people want to use the stock chamber instead of the Action Army chamber in the VSR. And you can, there's just a few things you have to keep in mind. There's this slider adjuster. Problem is, these sliders only connect to the arm on one place, so they only apply pressure on the right side and not on the left side, so that's going to cause your arm to get dragged down sideways, which can cause curving problems. Also, these stock chambers have a very old arm design with 2 prongs that go on top of a bucking, a conventional mount style bucking, and it's a very dated design. That's not going to work with the maple leaf buckings, because you need a nub, and the maple leaf buckings, well, I will recommend those because they're simply the best. So if you want to use this with a concave nub for the maple leaf, you will have to swap out the arm for either a maple leaf arm or a Panthera arm, where you can then use an aftermarket bucking, an aftermarket nub, I'm sorry. And that's definitely doable, but it's just something you have to consider. Also, these stock adjusters have another flaw. When the piston, when you fire the gun, the piston slams into the cylinder head right here, and that's going to cause some shock in this direction, which can shift the arm, the adjuster, this original slider adjuster, forward or backward ever so slightly. And you obviously don't want that, because that's going to mess up your Hopup setting. So if you do use the stock chamber, or any chamber for that matter, I would definitely recommend doing a TDC mod, which is basically like on this VSR, a screw directly on top of the arm, pressing down directly on top of the arm, and just take the entire slider assembly out, because, well, it's just no good. Now, what also happens from time to time is that people have a gun that's shooting perfectly straight, and then they disassemble it and clean it and put it back together, and then suddenly they have curving problems. This could be because they unknowingly rotated the nub, and now it's not in proper alignment anymore, and now they suddenly have a curving problem. In that case, switch to rotate the nub. That's always the first solution. But if that doesn't work, it happens quite often that people actually damage their nubs unknowingly. So if you have an Action Army chamber, then the nub is actually going to be installed in here, and that can be a bit of a tricky thing to do. Come on. Okay. the nub goes into this window, and that's actually pretty neat because that eliminates the possibility of any side-to-side movement, which is why the action arm chamber is actually pretty nice. However, if you don't properly put it in that window, and what happens from time to time is that people accidentally put it something like this, over-exaggerated, and when you put the arm down and start pressing on it and leave it compressed for a while because you go out and play with it, then what happens, I hate these nubs, then what happens is that you get a bit of a crack here on the side where it catches the window. So that is going to deform the nub on that side of the window. And because it is deformed there, it is compressed on one side and not on the other side, it's not going to have even thickness everywhere. And now all of a sudden you have this scenario and you've got a curving problem. So when you do install those maple leaf nubs, or actually any kind of nub, but the ski nub and everything suffer less from this problem because they're not made out of such a rubber. But if you install a nub in the action army chamber, or any chamber that has such a nub window, make sure it is perfectly straight into the window before lowering the arm, otherwise you're going to damage your nub and you're going to have a curving problem the next time you go out and play with it. And obviously, if it's catching on one side of the window, it's not even going to have even pressure everywhere, so you're going to have a curving problem to begin with. But even after you rectify that issue, the nub will still be damaged and you will still have a curving problem. So watch out for that one. That's concerning the VSR. For other rifles, for other guns, there are going to be different chambers available. Such as, for example, for the SRS you have the dual adjuster chamber. The PDI Hopup chambers for the Type 96 and the VSR also have this. So instead of one arm, they basically have two arms or two adjusters which you can set independently. So you can set the Hopup on the right side and on the left side independently of each other. So if you have a bit of curve to the right side, then you just put a bit more pressure on the left side and gone is the curve. This can work. I personally don't like that solution very much. I just prefer one adjuster and having your system dead straight on its own. But it is a solution that can work. You just have to keep in mind, especially with the VSR and the Type 96, that if you're going to do this and you want to TDC the gun, you also have to going to do a double TDC, which is hard because then you need tiny screws and small parts and everything, and it's just a hassle. I do not really recommend it, but it can work. It's a feasible solution. There are also guns that do not accept any standard parts. Do accept standard buckings, but not nubs, for example. And then you often get scenarios where people DIY their own nubs or try another solution. If you are going to make your own nub, such as when you have an R-Hop or a gun that doesn't accept standard aftermarket nubs, well, that's actually very easy. You just take a chunk of pencil eraser and you put it in the nub window directly on top of the bucking. The nice thing about pencil erasers is that they're fairly squishy, so they form to the bucking relatively well. They're not perfectly concave, but that's okay. It's a bit like an M nub, and that will provide even pressure all over the BB and work relatively well. But it's very easy to cut them not perfectly straight. So if you don't cut it exactly straight, then your nub may be a bit thicker on one side than the other, and you're going back to the curving problem. So if you're going to do that, if you have a system that doesn't accept standard aftermarket nubs, you can make your own nub. Just make sure you make it perfectly straight by cutting it perfectly straight. And if you do have a curving problem, you can always take it out again and cut a bit more off or shave a bit more off on one side or the other and fix your problem that way. So it's very neat for guns, such as some gas blowback guns or proprietary guns or old outdated guns, where you can put a normal bucking in there, or even an R-Hop or anything, but no standard aftermarket nub. You can just take a chunk of pencil eraser and cut it up in the rough shape of a nub, put it in there, and it will do the job. You will just have to make sure you cut it perfectly straight, and be prepared for some trial and error and disassembling and assembling it again to make sure it's cut perfectly square and you don't cause yourself any curving problems. But it is a solution. If you have an old gun that has a curving problem, you can always make your own nub and fix it that way. Also, it should be said that these nubs do often suffer from bad quality control, so it is not unheard of to buy a bucking and a nub and find curving problems, and one of them is bad and you buy another. If you have curving problems and you have narrowed it down to be just one part, so just a bucking or just a nub, don't be afraid to buy a new one and try it again, because, well, yeah, that just happens. It is how it is. I've even had people who had a faulty nub. We'd ruled out that it was the nub. They bought a new nub, same problem again. We bought another nub, and they actually ended up having two bad nubs in a row. It happens. So that is something you need to keep in mind. These things can and do fail, so if it happens, do not be afraid to buy a new one, because, well, it happens more often than you'd think. Another thing that can cause curving problems may sound very stupid, but you'd be amazed how often I help people out troubleshooting their gun, and it ends up being this. It's the wind. If you're shooting and you're shooting into the wind, then the BB is also going to go that way. And yeah, you would obviously say, oh, that's stupid, I'm not going to fall for that. You'd be amazed how many people come to me with problems. I help them troubleshooting it, and it ended up being this after many hours of trying to figure out what the problem was. So before you start thinking about curving problems, please do absolutely make sure it is not the wind, because nothing is more frustrating than trying to troubleshoot a problem that ends up being environmental factors at play after hours of trying to figure it out. I know it may sound stupid, but it just needs to be said. You'd be amazed how often this ends up being the problem. So I think that covers everything. If you have any questions regarding this video, be sure to let me know. And I plan on doing more of these tech-related videos in the near future. So if there's any subjects you'd like to see me cover, well, be sure to let me know and I'll consider it. Cheers, guys.